everyone. So, hello and namaskar. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to this hybrid seminar on India's evolving role on the global stage. This event is co-sponsored by the Belfer Center's Future of Diplomacy Project and the Indo-Pacific Security Project, and by the Center for Public Leadership. In recent weeks, many friends and acquaintances have expressed surprise and even shock about India's abstention from recent United Nations votes, deploring Russia's aggression against Ukraine. These reactions have come with many questions. What does this mean for U.S. India relations, both bilaterally and through the Quad? How will the war in Ukraine affect geopolitics in Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific? What does this mean for India's role on a global stage? We're fortunate today to have a chance to learn about these issues and much more from two distinguished experts and practitioners. I'm thrilled to welcome and introduce Ambassador Shivshankar Menon and Ambassador Richard Verma. Ambassador Menon is a special advisor at the Harvard Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. He's a visiting professor at Ashoka University in India and is chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies. Ambassador Menon, as you all know, was previously National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India from 2010 to 2014, Foreign Secretary of India from 2006 to 2009, and has served as the Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. In 2016, he published Choices: Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. His book on India and Asian geopolitics, The Past, Present, was released in 2021, and I'm very grateful to him for signing my copy just a couple of days ago. Ambassador Menon was a Fisher Family Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and Richard Wilhelm Fellow at MIT in 2015. He was chosen as one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. Ambassador Menon is also chairman of the advisory board for the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi, distinguished fellow of the Center for Social and Economic Progress in India, distinguished visiting research fellow at the National University of Singapore, member of the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group, and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Welcome, sir. Ambassador Richard Verma is the General Counsel and Head of Global Public Policy for MasterCard. In this role, he oversees the company's law and policy functions in the United States and around the world. He brings over 25 years of international experience across senior levels of business, law, diplomacy, and the military. He's a member of the company's management committee. Ambassador Verma, as we know, previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to India, where he led one of the largest U.S. diplomatic missions and championed historic progress in bilateral cooperation on defense, trade, and clean energy. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State and also worked on Capitol Hill as the National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader. Ambassador Verma practiced law for many years at Steptoe and Johnson in Washington, D.C., and is the former vice chairman of the Asia Group, an international consulting firm. In addition, he's a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and the recipient of a number of military awards and civilian decorations, including the Meritorious Service Medal and the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Ambassador Verma is a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and a trustee of Lehigh University. He serves on a number of boards and commissions, including the T. Rowe Prize Corporate Board and the National Endowment for Democracy Board of Directors. Ambassador Verma holds multiple degrees, including a PhD from Georgetown University and a JD from American University, putting us all to shame here at the Kennedy School. Welcome, Ambassador Verma.
Thank you very much.
And welcome back to Harvard for both of you. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
So our plan for the next roughly 55 minutes is as follows. For about 30 minutes, I'll ask both our distinguished panelists a series of questions about the past, present, and potential future of India's foreign policy and about U.S.-India relations. We'll then have about 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Thank you all for joining us in person, and thank you to those of us joining us virtually. We hope to have a really engaging discussion with all of you. And we'll save the last 5 minutes of the seminar for closing remarks from the panelists and to wrap up. So without any further ado, let's dive in. History is always a great place to start. And so let's start there. Ambassador Menon, in your book on India and Asian geopolitics, you described how India's foreign policy managed 3 phases of global geopolitics and their transitions. Could you please give us an overview of these geopolitical phases and how India approached their transitions?
Well, the way I see it, well, thank you for having me here, actually. And it's a real pleasure to be here with Rich, who's done so much for the India-US relationship in multiple ways, not just as ambassador, but before and after that. It's your question about how India coped changes in the international situation. I mean, the way I see it, there were three obvious phases. One, of course, the Cold War, bipolar world, where India chose not to choose sides, which was a pretty brave choice, if you think of it, in the late 40s, early 50s. Considering India's condition at that time, lack of capacity, but it seemed to work. The second phase, of course, was after the end of the Cold War, the unipolar moment, as it were, when the US is the sole superpower. US is still the sole superpower. But this was a period, I would call them in the book, actually, the globalization decades. And in many ways, India was one of the greatest beneficiaries of those decades. Those are the high growth years for India. They're the years, maybe the second greatest beneficiary after China of the globalization period, which sort of ended in 2008. Since when you've seen pushback against globalization, you've seen, I think it's, in a sense, what I describe now, at least, as a world adrift, a world between orders, as it were. Because there is, and I think the proof of that really was the pandemic. I mean, the international order just didn't respond. 2008, global financial crisis, the world actually responded. The G20 stood up in April 2009, agreed on a whole set, and we avoided another Great Depression. We avoided what happened in the 30s. We did manage to respond as a system, but we didn't. What did India do? India went through simultaneously with the end of the Cold War, went through a huge internal economic crisis, shifted course completely, while saying it was doing exactly the same thing. Narsimha Rao never admitted. He always said, no, I'm following a Nehru in foreign policy, while he did a 180-degree turn in every which respect. I mean, he opened diplomatic relations with Israel. He really worked on the relationship with the US. I mean, that was the core of it. But also opened up the economy, dismantled licensing Raj, not so much Inspector Raj, but at least licensing Raj. And India began its process of economic integration with the rest of the world, with huge results and big changes. Today, however, throughout this, India has been conscious that the purpose of foreign policy is to enable the transformation of India, and that it cannot do it alone. There was no way. So bipolar world, don't choose sides, work with everyone for India's transformation. Try for a peaceful environment because you need that. Unipolar world, work with the sole superpower, where you have difficult relationships, like with China, come to a modus vivendi, which lasted for about 30 years, kept peace, did the border peace and tranquility agreement. Confused world, frankly, work with whoever you can. But why does India keep going its own way? I mean, whether you call it non-alignment, strategic autonomy, whatever. Because frankly, there is no other country at the same levels of development, with similar identical interests, whether it's geography, history, and so on. It's hard to find. But what is clear to me is there has been increasing congruence with the US over time. And to my mind, that is going to increase. Not identity of views or interests, but at least congruence and growing congruence. And I think you see it in the relationship. You could say that India-US relations today are deeper, closer than they've been for ever before. I still think there's a tremendous amount of potential in there, which both sides need to tap, and that both sides need to be careful, especially in this confused world situation. I better stop there. I can go on and on. That's a big book, 400 pages.
It's a gripping read. Highly recommend to everybody. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Verma, in your dissertation titled Overcoming the Hesitation of History, you examined the US's approach to India through the years, with a special focus on 5 pivotal years. Could you please share an overview of this history from the US's perspective?
Sure, I will do that. But first, let me also say thank you for inviting me. It's great to be in an in-person event, and especially with Ambassador Menon, who's done so much for this relationship. I remember meeting him in the Senate in 2006, 2007, when Prime Minister Singh was there meeting with senators talking about the U.S. India civil nuclear deal. He's really been one of the pivotal persons. And to talk about U.S. India relations at this particular place, at Belfer, at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and I think of the long line of people who have worked on this relationship, obviously Ash Carter and Joe Nye and Graham Allison and Bob Blackwell and Nick Burns. I'm going to leave people out. But I'll go back to John Kenneth Galbraith, who had quite a legendary impact on U.S. India relations. There's a great story of Galbraith calling Kennedy just after Kennedy wins the election in November of 1960. And Galbraith was actually more interested in taking Kennedy's Senate seat. He said, wouldn't this be great? Shouldn't I come in and replace you in the Senate? And Kennedy says, I have another plan. And it's more important than serving in the Senate by a factor of 5 to 1. Ooh. And that is, you need to go to India to be the U.S. ambassador there. So Kennedy actually viewed the job quite seriously, and Galbraith was legendary in his impact. Ambassador, if I could just pick up on your 3 phases and really think about U.S.-India relations in 3 phases. Because I used to think of this roller coaster with the relationship just going up and down over, depending on which year you picked. But really, when I step back, I see 3 distinct phases. I see a period of actually strong upward trajectory from 1947 to 1963. I'm using the 47 mark as India's independence. And people, I just want to emphasize this, people ignore that period of progress. And they ignore the Eisenhower commitment to India. It's funny, I had the great honor to talk to Susan Eisenhower a few years ago, and she said that President Eisenhower used to talk about India all the time and how he had to get to India to visit India. And of course, he became the first president to visit India. And then Kennedy had this, again, very, very strong feeling towards India. We could come back to that. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is from 1964 to 1998. It's not a particularly good phase. And, one of the great aspects about being a U.S. ambassador in India is when you go in to have a conversation in the bureaucracy in Delhi, most times the conversation starts sometimes in the late 1960s, early 70s, and you have to work your way forward to the current day. And again, we can talk about why that was a particularly tough period. And I think it's actually worth talking about that because there's a certain amount of risk that we could repeat some of the mistakes of that period, because there was one country that divided us during that period, and that was the then Soviet Union. And we lined up on different sides. And that set in motion a very I'd say dark series of events for a period of time. And then there's a third period, a third phase. And I would say that's from 1999 to the present. And that has been a very positive phase. And it's had a lot of hard work, but it has been an upward trajectory for some 23 years. That upward trajectory is not guaranteed, and we have to work at it very hard. So just very quickly, and like Ambassador Menon, I could talk about this for a few hours. I looked at 5 specific years. I looked at 1962, 1971, 1998, 2005, and 2015. And I drew lessons from each of those. But I do want to remind people about a few things we learned from those years. In 1962, India faces a real existential crisis with Chinese troops pouring over its border. What a lot of people don't know is that Prime Minister Nehru sent 2 urgent letters to President Kennedy asking for military assistance. What a lot of people also don't know is that President Kennedy delivered that military assistance. Thousands of tons of ammunition, overflight, intelligence, logistics support. And we were there in a very strong way, and people forget that. And that's how close we were. Now, fast forward just a few years to 1971, and things go dramatically downhill. And over that period of time, we have a change in administration here. Frankly, President Nixon basically had a very, in many ways, a conventional view of the world. You were either with us in the fight against communism in the Soviet Union, or you were against us. And he found India to be very much against US interests. Lined up firmly behind Pakistan, did his outreach to China via Islamabad, which set relations with India back even further. And then in the struggle, what was then East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh, Nixon even deploys the 7th Fleet of the United States Navy up the coast of India to deter further Indian involvement in the conflict. That's how bad things got. We're still recovering from that moment and series of moments today. And then if you go further into the years, we then entered into this long period of drift. And by the 90s and President Clinton, we were looking for a much different relationship, a much more hopeful relationship. And what we got were 2 detonations of nuclear devices by the Indians and the Pakistanis, which again set us back. But President Clinton was undeterred. And I just want to mention this. He did one thing that I think is probably at the heart of what sets us into the modern positive trajectory, and that's he delinked United States policy between India and Pakistan. He de-hyphenated the relationship. And I think President Clinton doesn't get enough credit for doing that. And there are reasons for why he did that. I'm going to stop there because I think we're going to talk about the modern era a little bit. But don't forget that history is recent. And we are, again, at risk of drifting back into some of these historical moments that could set us apart. And I think that is concerning.
Thank you, Ambassador. Coming into the modern era, as you mentioned. So, Ambassador Menon, I'll start with you. You've spoken and written extensively about the continuing need for India to preserve and protect strategic autonomy and to prioritize, as borrow one of your favorite terms, issue-based coalitions of the willing. In your view, why does India still need strategic autonomy?
Well, as I said before, I mean, it's hard to see another country with identical interests with India. And the fact is that Indian interests have grown, expanded over time. India today is much more integrated into the world economy. I mean, I don't think most Indians realize that half or so of our GDP is really the external sector. We started reform in 1990, only about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. But by 2014, it was something like 49.6%. That's just merchandise trade. You add services, you add remittances, you're talking about. So in a sense, it's natural for India's interests to have expanded as she grew, developed. And to protect that, she needs to work with others. But in a situation where there is no working international order, what do? You find friends who share your interests on particular issues. Maritime security, it's a natural partnership between India and the US, for instance. We saw it after the tsunami in 2004. Who were the first responders on the spot? Were the Indian Navy, the US Navy. And it just grew from there. And that's really the seed from which you've now got what we do together in the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific. But different issues take a different set of partners, especially in a confused world like this. Cybersecurity, there's some So you look for those who are willing and those who are able, and you build issue-based coalitions. But if you look at, say, the security of the sea lanes coming out of the Persian Gulf, who are the 4 biggest importers of oil through Hormuz? China, India, Japan, Korea. That's a strange combination. The US doesn't need that anymore. But the Fifth Fleet is really what we all depend on for the security of those sea lanes. So depending on the issues, you get different sets. So when there's piracy off the Horn of Africa threatening those sea lanes, everybody is there, right? India, the EU, NATO, the US Navy, Chinese Navy, Japanese Navy is there. When there's piracy off Malacca in the 90s, it's a regional issue. Singapore organizes the rest of us, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, take care of it. So you're in a confused world, and where therefore for me, you need to maintain that autonomy. You can't just say, okay, this alliance is going to take all the decisions for me, because your interests vary, and you need so this mantra of issue-based coalition with the willing and able is what I use. If it were a less confused world, maybe not. But so far, at least, that's what's worked through all these 3 phases. And I don't see that changing very, very rapidly. I want to add one thing to what Rich said earlier. You know, when President Eisenhower came to India, he got a rapturous public response, spontaneous, in Calcutta, the most leftist of all metros in India. He got something like 1.3 million people out to welcome him, spontaneously. It's never been matched since. Of course, Trump claims he got more, but it was incredible. And there's an interesting dynamic there in India-US relations. At the popular level, the US has always been admired and respected, right through. And when we did civil nuclear, for instance, it was clear the polls were showing 93% support among the public. The political class, the chattering class, the media, the politicians, very different problem. And I think they tend to occupy the space. But ever since they've been measuring which country do you admire most in India, the US has always been in the top 3, good relations or bad officially. And I think that's worth remembering, that there is more to this dynamic than just, you know, state-to-state relations.
I think that's right. The people have been way out in front of the governments. They've been faster. The glue that bonds the 2 countries together are really at that level, and not necessarily between the 2 capitals.
I guess this segues really well to my next question to you, Ambassador Verma, which is you were getting to this in your previous response, which is U.S.-India relations in the last 2 decades have been on this upward trajectory. You mentioned the civilian nuclear deal, the strategic military partnership, growing collaborations under the auspices of Quad. What factors have driven this warming of U.S.-India relations alongside India's continued adherence to strategic?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there was the dehyphenation. We separated out the policies. I'd say that's first. Second, in the US, we kind of gave up on what had been this defining policy objective for India, and that was for India to give up its nuclear weapons, or to sign the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We kind of failed at all of those objectives, and I think a much more practical administration came in the early 2000s and said, we're going to do this differently. Again, it was facilitated by, I think, the Clinton, not only dehyphenation, but also then coming to India, welcomed by millions of people across the country, and saying it's not enough to be natural allies. In principle, we actually have to demonstrate to our people that we're going to do things together. That civil nuclear agreement essentially recognized and allowed India to be a nuclear weapons power. Ambassador Menon would never say that publicly during the negotiations, but that's exactly what happened. It had far less to do with civil nuclear assistance. In fact, to this day, not a single nuclear plant has been constructed by US companies in India. But what was so significant about that was, again, recognizing India's ability to be a nuclear power. But the US also went to bat for India in the international system and righted what India believed was the kind of unfair post-war international institutions that favored just the victors of World War II, not the global South, not the emerging powers like India. So we did a lot in that deal, and I credit so many different people. I was fortunate to be, really fly on the wall watching this happen. I was working in the Senate, just a few feet from the Senate floor. I was in that kind of very rare classified briefing. The Senate went into a rare classified session to debate this, and it really took a lot of energy. It took the Indian American diaspora as well. Without the Indian American diaspora, that would not have happened. So that's another factor. So you have dehyphenization, it's civil nuclear. You had the US Congress involved in the relationship in a positive way for the first time, including a then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who now happens to be president of the United States, who made a prediction in 2005, while we were all there, who said, if the US and India are the closest of friends and partners in 2020, the world will be a safer place. And he was right. So Congress, the diaspora, the defense framework, which Ambassador Menon helped negotiate along with Nick Burns and others, talked about some things that are so super important. The peaceful resolution of disputes, upholding of international norms and human rights, the opening of sea lanes for free and open commerce. That defense framework agreement did not have some geographical limitation to it. It did not say this is just for Asia. That was a broad framework. It allowed India to become a strategic partner of the United States, and there set in motion this incredible strategic partnership where India does more defense exercises with the United States now than any other country. There was a point, 2016, we actually overtook Russia as the leading provider of defense equipment to India. And again, when I was there in 2015, I got to see kind of the comprehensive nature of the relationship. If you were to say to people that the US and India were going to be the two parties that helped bring the Paris Climate Agreement to fruition, people would have thought you had lost your mind. But that's exactly what happened. India, and under Prime Minister Modi and President Obama, the kind of hours that they put into negotiating every detail, India brought along the rest of the developing world with it when it said, we're going to do this. There was an understanding there. So we saw what's positive and in the relationship and the great potential over that 20-year period. But, and this is a big kind of qualification, 20-year relationships are quite fragile. They're not very durable. We don't have a huge kind of trade set of relationships with India. It's very ad hoc. The companies are doing it on their own. And so the relationship still suffers from this inability to withstand shocks. It doesn't have the trust built up the way it should. So when a situation like Ukraine presents itself, it tests every lever of this relationship. It pushes this now 22-year-old framework to the limits. And we're seeing that play out today.
Thank you for that great segue as well, Ambassador Verma. So I'd like to talk, excuse me, for a few minutes about Ukraine before opening the floor to questions from the audience. Three pieces of information to remind the audience about. So India has abstained in multiple UN votes so far on the Security Council, General Assembly, and Human Rights Council, and India has not explicitly condemned the invasion. India has been in diplomatic overdrive. Since the war commenced on February 24th, there are reports of more than 24 conversations at the level of Prime Minister Modi and External Affairs Minister Shivshankar, including many in-person visits by senior officials from the US, the UK, Germany, and also Russia and China. Finally, third piece of information, as Ambassador Verma was referring to, reactions from the US do indicate concern about India's stance. Most recently, we've all seen in the news about the US Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, Dalit Singh, who was very blunt during his visit to India less than a week ago. To quote just a bit of one of his remarks, I don't think anyone would believe that if China once again breached the line of actual control, that Russia will come running to India's defense. Ambassador Menon, turning to you first, sir. I guess I have two questions based on this context. So could you please help us understand India's calculus with this issue? And is this calculus productive so far? Do you see challenges?
Well, to the facts that you mentioned, I'd add that India condemned what happened in Bucha and actually called for an impartial international investigation into what happened in Bucha. So, I mean, you know, it seems to me that we need to separate three things here in the Indian approach. We have argued for some time, and this is since 2012 at least, that several parties have legitimate interests in the Ukraine. I mean, the eastern borders of the Ukraine are less than 300 miles from Moscow. So the presence of, say, NATO missiles, troops, would bother the Russians, just like President Kennedy was bothered by Russian medium-range missiles in Cuba. But the western borders of Ukraine are less than 100 miles from Warsaw, from Vienna, from Prague, from Bratislava, less than 300 miles from Berlin. So the reverse applies as well. And there should be some way of diplomatically negotiating a way forward out of this, which respects Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, but also assures other people that their security is not going to be threatened. And that's really where India proceeds. Now, obviously, for good, selfish reasons, India doesn't want to have to choose between Russia and the US. My summary of this is the US is an essential partner for India, for India's transformation, whether it is not just access to financial systems, education, but as a partner in the shaping of the world. This is the sole superpower. And there's no way that we can transform India if we don't have a decent relationship with the US. The US is essential, but Russia is desirable because, frankly, India is both continental and maritime. And there is not much of a US presence on the Eurasian continent today. After Afghanistan, the withdrawal. And if we are to deal with the situation on Eurasia, and our problems with China are continental, basically the land border is the source of a lot of the trouble. We need to work with Iran, with Russia, with the others. So we don't want to have to make that choice. So Russia is a desirable partner. But over time, if you look at it, you know, we have actually tried to diversify our arms dependence on Russia by, in, I think, 2002, 88% of our arms imports were from Russia. By 2020, that was down to 35%. And the rest of it was from the West, was from the US, France, Israel. But when you look at stocks, then you're talking much higher figures. So when people say 80% of arms, what they mean is stocks. And it takes decades to move out of stocks. And you can't just throw all your tanks away or your aircraft. So I think this is why for India, this is not a choice that India wants to make or will make. And we'll do everything possible to avoid having to make that choice. When it's posed as you're either with us or against us, the immediate Indian reaction is why? You know, because I don't think the US is willing to replace the Russians in certain things that they do with India. But the Russians certainly cannot replace the US. So it's a complicated calculus. So when you say, why is India, you know, as it were, straddling the fence, I personally would have preferred a slightly more forward-leaning. An invasion is an invasion. And we did speak for the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine, but I think we could have gone a little further, called it by its real name. And certainly I'm glad that we at least responded the right way to Bucha. But those are matters of detail. But basically, I don't see India, therefore, picking a side in this. But instead, Prime Minister Modi has spoken to Putin, to the Ukrainian leaders, the president, over and over again, saying, please talk to each other and settle this peacefully. We had 18,000 students in the Ukraine that we had to get out, and we got them out, which was quite a job in the middle of a war. So for me, that's why you're seeing what you're seeing.
I guess what I guess what I would say is part of the maybe distress on the U.S. side is that we thought India had picked a side, and that was not on the U.S. versus. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. We thought that they had picked the side of a democratic order governing this century, where big states could not just walk into less military equipped states and seize territory. So I don't want to actually make this about U.S.-India relations. Again, having served in the job, the least effective thing you can do is wave your finger from Washington and say you should be doing X, Y, and Z. And when I talk about making the mistakes of the past, I think the Nixon framework, you're either with us or with that or against us, is exactly the wrong framework and the wrong thing to do. So, but what can we do? I think people ask me all the time, what's happening in American politics? How did Trump come to power? And, you know, part of it was an American exhaustion about being the superpower, having to organize and defend the post-war order everywhere on the globe, from Asia to across the Pacific, Europe, Latin America. And so there was American retrenchment, there was an American exhaustion, and there was hope that other countries would stand up. One of those countries that we believed would stand up would be India, and actually defend the post-war order, not defend some potential vision of what was happening in the 60s or 70s, but what was happening today. What was at risk to this century if this behavior is allowed to continue? And I think what we're discovering is that we got to continue to play for the long game, that India is not potentially ready to stand up in the way that others had hoped. The US is back in it. You can sense a level of exhaustion again, but it's super important. I also just want to make 2 points that are going to be, you know, I think we don't talk about enough. Again, this notion that India and Russia have this, you know, terrifically close relationship. Again, over the last 20 years, I've seen Russia be the leading provider of military equipment to China. China is India's, I think, #1 geostrategic concern. I've seen Russia not necessarily welcome India into the nuclear suppliers group. I've seen an India that has embraced the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. I've seen a Russia embrace the Taliban leadership. I've seen Russia do arms deals with Pakistan as the US has decreased. So I think this notion that somehow there's this trusted, favored partnership of the last 10 or 15 years, I think defies some of the facts. The other point I would just make is that this notion that the US has not been there for India and will not be there, that has also come to the fore. I go back, you know, again, part of the value of doing a dissertation that no one reads is that in 1962, it was the US that stood with India, it was not Russia. Again, if you look at the last 20 years, and I should have mentioned this earlier, part of the reason the US and India are closer together is obviously because of China's rise. But the security architecture in Asia is undergirded by the trillions of dollars, trillions, that the US has expended, the sacrifice of US lives, the bases that have been put there, the 60% of the Navy, the 300 ships that we have. I could go on and on to suggest that Asia is not a safer place because of US involvement in the US role, I think just is a fundamental misread of the current picture. So I just want to make sure people understand when they evaluate what's happening to take the full picture, modern picture into account, not grab a date from the 60s or 70s and say we need to go back to that. We don't want to have a third country divide the US and India going forward, and I'm hopeful we can get through this.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it's time. I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well. I have so many more questions, but I'll park them for now. I'd love to get our audience involved. So anyone in the room who has a question, please raise your real hand. And anyone in the virtual room, please raise your Zoom hands, and Erica will call on you. So if we could start with...
My name's Sakshi. Hi, I'm an MPA student here at Kennedy School.
Sakshi, could you wait for a second? Yeah.
I'm an MPA student here at the Kennedy School, and my question is around India's. You mentioned that India has a need for strategic autonomy, and I want to understand what that means for strategic leadership, especially when it comes to things like climate change. And I'm thinking in particular about the recent COP26 summit, where at the end of the negotiation, it was Indian negotiators who pulled back and prevented the final conclusion from being as strong as it could have been, which was interesting to me, given that climate change is an issue of extreme importance to India. So I wanted to understand your take on India's role in climate change leadership, especially when it comes to forums like the COP26.
Just to go back a little bit, you know, what you were saying, Rich, about India stepping up, playing its role and being reluctant, it's exactly what the Europeans used to say to the US before the Second World War. And it's a historical pattern almost, that powers take a while to understand. I mean, they're like adolescents, right? They have the strength, but they don't know how to use it. And my son took a long time for him to realize that he could beat me at tennis, whereas he could have done it years before. It's the same problem. I think it takes a while, and most successful rising powers in history, if you look at them, they followed an accommodationist strategy. So, I mean, India is not opposing the US order, is not saying that the US is not the basis of security in the Asia Pacific. In fact, is assuming that, and is one of the greatest beneficiaries, and admits that it's a great beneficiary of the security that the US has provided right through the Indo-Pacific, through maritime Asia. There's no question. But whether India is going to step in and do what the US used to do, I think that's a bigger bridge. That's maybe a step too far. And it reminds me of the fact that this has happened over and over again before. In fact, the risk is those who try too soon, like Wilhelmine Germany, like, you know, Japan in the 30s, assume leadership which they can't actually perform. And so this judgment of when do you have the capacity and where do you exercise your leadership, this, I think, is there's no science to this. It's not like, okay, you've got so much percent of world GDP, now you can do this. I don't think so.
I think, Ambassador, we take
India. I think we're somehow, when you look at it historically, I think we're in that phase where, you know, everyone used to accuse the US of not being responsible enough. The Kindleberger, I mean, what, you know, this sort of argument. And I think we're somewhere in there as far as India's evolution as a global power is concerned.
I think it's a great point. I would just say sometimes we take India at its own words, though, which is we want a seat at the high table. We want to be on.
The problem with foreign policy. You know, you say things for a domestic audience, and then foreigners will listen to it.
Right.
And believe you.
We listen. Seat at the high table, seat at the permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Which, by the way, I've never said.
Right. Net security provider in the Asia Pacific. I mean, I could go on. So you start to say, okay.
If you look at the trend, India has always been proactive in the subcontinent. Over time, maritime security in the Indian Ocean region, India has played a bigger and bigger role. With the US, originally not with the US, but now with the US with other partners. So as I see it, this is an evolving situation, and it's something that you'll see grow. On climate change, there is this clear sort of, the domestic politics pulls you in another direction, because at home it's seen as an energy issue. And how can you deny India the energy to develop when everybody else has done their share and exploited whatever potential there was? And now suddenly we're being told to make sacrifices. Whereas internationally, it's seen as you put it rightly, as a climate change and the effects on others. Can India wean itself from coal? It's a huge debate at home. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. If India does, it will do it for its own reasons, frankly. And if you look at this kind of ambition on solar energy, the kind of ambition on now green hydrogen, for instance, I think that actually offers hope. But until there is a visible sort of off-ramp, which there isn't today for the Indian economy, I think it's unreasonable to expect much more forward-looking positions abroad. Because ultimately, for any government in India, it doesn't matter what their political leanings are, it's at home that they're going to win those votes. So that explains this sort of on again, off again kind of, and when you say, why the hesitation? I mean, it's such a noble cause. Their answer would be, yeah, well, why doesn't everybody else do something about it? Why us? And why us now, after all this? The equity argument, and the arguments. But I don't think, if you look at it over since Rio, since '92, actually India's position has evolved considerably on climate change. And especially under the Modi government, I think they've been willing to do much more and undertake bigger commitments than before. And as Rich said, I mean, when we work together, we can actually achieve much more. It's easier done because, frankly, when it comes to a multilateral agreement, there's very little guarantee, there's no enforcement. Whereas in a bilateral agreement, at least you're confident that your partner has an interest in implementing it, which is why I think the way it was done before Paris actually made a difference.
Thank you. Erica, could I check with you if anyone online has their hands up?
So we
Great.
have, hold on, we have about 70 people who are in the Zoom room. And let's try to, if you can ask your question live, we'll see if the technology gods allow us. If not, please type your question in the chat, but we invite you to unmute. Joseph Johnson, can you hear us? Go ahead.
Hi, I can hear you. Yes, thank you very much. Really for Ambassador Menon, great to hear you and thank you for your remarks. India may have condemned the massacres at Bucha, but it has not named Russia as the perpetrator of those alleged war crimes, nor assigned responsibility. And in the most recent meeting of the UN Security Council, India, in its intervention, didn't even hint at Russia being involved in, let alone responsible for, the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Ukraine and all of the war crimes I've just mentioned at Bucha. So my question really is whether you think this kind of equivocation is really sustainable for India as more evidence of what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine comes to light as we learn more about what Russian occupation of Ukraine is actually entailing. Is this sustainable?
But I can't answer for the government of India why it chose to name, not name. But I can see there's a logical problem there. You can't call for an impartial international inquiry and then conclude beforehand who's guilty. Presumably, if we do have an inquiry and you have the evidence there impartially attested to, then presumably there's no escaping naming. But I can't answer for why the government chose this particular path now or not. As a general principle, though, I think, and I think they said this earlier in the General Assembly and in the Security Council, that neither an invasion or military means nor name calling is going to solve the problem. That you have to bring them both to the table. But, sustainable, certainly not. If there is an impartial inquiry, if that evidence is known. But I'd be very careful in actually jumping to a big conclusion right now. From everything that's evident, I think it's quite clear who did these atrocities. I don't think there's any doubt, and I've said myself personally, I would like a more forward-leaning sort of statement, but why the government chose this, I can't answer for.
Shall we go to one more online question?
We actually have Priyanka Krishnamurthy. Can you hear us? Can you unmute yourself? And
Yeah.
if you can, please put on your video. If you're comfortable doing so. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here, Ambassador Menon and Ambassador Verma. My name is Priyanka. I'm a second-year MPA student, and I'm from Sri Lanka. And that's the nature of the question I have about the Sri Lankan economic crisis. I think two of a few countries who have been very involved in providing financing for Sri Lanka over the past couple of months have been China and India. And in some sense, it seems like the way that the Sri Lankan government is trying to get out of the mess they've created is by playing the two regional powers against each other. I wanted to know about your thoughts on the Sri Lankan crisis and how the role that the country plays will determine kind of the regional order as well, and the relationship between India and China. Thank you.
You're a former ambassador there. I think that
But to my mind, the crisis, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka is really a Sri Lankan crisis. What India is doing, what China is doing, is applying band-aids to the wound, to the problem. I mean, what is trying to minimize the effects on the welfare of the people, supplying food, supplying, let's say, credits which can see the government over from, prevent a complete default and a collapse of the economy. But that's not a solution to the problem, and that's going to be solved politically within Sri Lanka. You've seen the whole cabinet resigned, there's demonstrations on the streets, troops were deployed, and those are not things that China, India, anybody else is going to sort out. Fundamentally, it's a rich economy, Sri Lanka, and I think it's more an internal economic management issue, which Sri Lanka will have to sort out for itself. And Sri Lanka has the means. Sri Lanka has very bright people. It's amazing how much excellence Sri Lanka has produced. I've always been amazed that out of a small society like that, you name it, whether it's, architects, economists, you name it, cricketers.
Right.
It's really quite remarkable. So I'm pretty sort of optimistic about Sri Lanka in the medium and long term. Problem is the politics of it are really, I think, get in the way of finding a rational solution. But why waste a good crisis? This is a good time to act. And crisis does concentrate the mind. And from what I've seen or heard from Sri Lankan friends, I think at least they're thinking radical thoughts. They're thinking big thoughts about how to reorder the economy. But it's not something that anybody outside can sort out. And the regional order needs a stable, peaceful, developing Sri Lanka. I think it's important because Sri Lanka is important not just in a geostrategic sense in terms of its location. I used to say that it's a immovable aircraft carrier 14 miles off the Indian coast. And which is why we're also interested in what happens in Sri Lanka. But I still think that it has to be sorted out within Sri Lanka itself. And I can't predict that. What do you think?
No, I agree with that. And I think it brings into focus the complexities of South Asia, the governance issues, the political issues, the investments by the Chinese that they've made in different parts of South Asia. And do we have response? Do the Indians, do the Western nations have a response to that? Whether you're talking about Sri Lanka or Nepal or Bangladesh, Pakistan's a whole different matter. But these are. I wish we had more focus in Washington on what was happening in this part of the world, but it's super, super important. And I'd agree with your assessment about how well Sri Lanka has done economically. It's an incredible economic story and a very difficult political and security story.
But it's interesting. China invested a lot of money in Colombo Port. And 83% of what goes through that port is to or from India. It's basically transit trade lighterage across both ports. So the port makes money. India has the use of this port. China's invested, put money into it. The port pays back the Chinese. Everything works fine. That's, for me, the model that you need to follow. An open economic, it has an economic rationale. It makes sense. You look at Hambantota, $1.2 billion worth of Chinese money, can't pay back. So 99-year lease. Then everybody in India says, why did they build that port? There must be more to this. There's no commercial justification, so it must be strategic. And the only way they can justify it is if the PLA Navy comes there. And then the poison enters all the relationships. Right. I mean, and so for me, this Sri Lanka in itself, just within 150 miles of each other, you have these two contrasting examples of how to deal with, how we should deal with issues like this and how we should respond. I mean, I don't want to draw big lessons out of it. I'm not contradicting your point that we still don't know how to deal with it.
No, I agree that. You want to take one or two more here and before
Shall we? Do we have time? You're the boss, Erica. Okay.
If we have more questions, yeah, please. Go
ahead. Two hands.
We'll take both at one time.
Thank you, Ambassador Verma and Ambassador Menon. It has been really great listening your perspective on these complex issues. My question is around, we have been talking about this India's position, global positioning, how it has improved in terms of foreign policy and diplomacy in past 2 decades. I wanted to understand, the recent crisis, from pandemic to this war, it has also uncovered the inefficiency and lacking capability of multilateral institutions. There has been a lot of news in the media that these multilaterals are not able to solve the challenges of 21st century. How do you see India playing a role, leverage this global position, to solve, maybe to reform these multilateral institutions, or maybe having some, bringing some new vision, some new thinking in terms of, multilateral institution, how the countries should work together? Thank you.
Take one more and then we'll take them together.
All right, I'll just make my question very short. So I'm just wondering, what do you think of the structural differences between India and China in terms of its foreign relations? I mean, there are definitely some common interests that we can pursue in economics, but what are some fundamental differences that hurdle the relationship going forward? Thanks.
I think there was the last one here.
Thank you. My name is Amita. I'm also an MPA from HKS. It's hard to think about current affairs in India right now without thinking about the kind of nationalist tendency of politics and general sentiment in India, I would say, and especially sort of anti-US sentiment that I think has come out, especially with this Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I'm curious, Ambassador Menon, how do you see that shaping foreign policy right now? And Ambassador Verma, is this a question or concern for US and how it thinks about relations with India?
Well, actually, I have a common answer to the two of you. What the pandemic has done, and actually post-global financial crisis situation has done, is really to drive countries inwards, drive their politics inwards, to stress self-reliance, whether in China, whether in India, Atmanirbharta, even in the US, Build Back Better, and why get involved in? The US hasn't gone back to TPP, hasn't enabled dispute settlement with the WTO. I mean, that faith in the multilateral system generally is very, very low. And most countries have chosen, and the pandemic accelerated that, to actually go back to themselves, rely on themselves and look inwards rather than rely on anyone else. And the multilateral system failed, as you said. So that feeds, I mean, and these new authoritarian leaders that we've seen in the last decade or so across the board, and from Japan to China to India to, you know, I mean, Putin, of course, Trump, whatever. I think that they've based their legitimacy on nationalism, on a form of ethnic nationalism, ultra-nationalism almost. I mean, it's true of China. The China dream is for Zhonghua Minzu. It's for the race, for the Chinese race. It's the same in India. What people call Hindu nationalism, I think wrongly, because everybody involved is Hindu, whether they're so. But anyway, it's sort of short form. And this problem makes diplomacy much more difficult, because the more your legitimacy is based on this ultra-nationalism, the less capable you are of negotiating, of give and take, of bargaining. So when you say, where's the structural problem in India-China relations? That's one of them, actually. It's the nature of domestic politics in our societies and what it has done to our capacity to, today, for instance, the India-China boundary used to be described as a problem left over from history, which meant not our fault, the British, blame the colonialists, you know, which is okay, because then it's something you can bargain, you can negotiate, you can give and take. Now it's framed in both countries, but especially in China, as a sovereignty issue, as defending the territorial integrity of the motherland. That's not something you can bargain with, you can give. So it becomes much harder to accommodate. So for me, the fundamental problem is there. Therefore, our capacity to deal with the issues that arise, and there will be issues, your neighbors, I mean, you can't help that. So in a sense, all your questions lead to the same problem. Now it's easy, this is the diagnosis, but what's the solution? I wish I had a solution. I mean, there is no simple solution to offer to this. Maybe Rich can do that.
Oh, sure. In the last 2 minutes, we'll fix multilateral institutions and nationalism. I agree with what you laid out. I do think the pandemic exposed kind of these great weakness in the international system as well, you know, and every country came up with its own solutions. Every country came up with its own vaccine policies. You couldn't travel. I mean, it was a complete mess. And with great, unfortunately, human toll, we are getting through to the other side of it, but no credit to the international architecture or international system. So those transnational threats are not going away. And whether it's climate, whether it's terrorism, whether it's mass migration, whether it's pandemics, we've got to figure this out. We need an architecture for this century. If the 20th century architecture was alliances, kind of bipolarity, a big U.S. footprint militarily, that architecture doesn't exist today. And we need something to replace it. We do believe that countries like the United States and India must play a leading role in developing that architecture. We have I think, a very common view of that architecture that's undergirded by values. And maybe just try to close with that point. If we lose the shared values between the US and India, if that becomes kind of secondary, this will become a very transactional relationship. It will not have the staying power. We will not be able to forge the kind of international consensus on really difficult issues. And that's why this relationship is different. It is why it is special. I could go back actually hundreds of years on this question of shared values, not just the last 22 years. Two largest democracies in the world We cannot underestimate that. We can't underestimate that power and that capability, especially today when that vision is very much under threat and under duress. And so, yeah, it's super important that we actually come to a meeting of the minds. Just quote Ash Carter here, director. He said we have a strategic handshake with India. We will go as far and as fast as India is willing to go in this relationship. And I still think that's the right approach, but we have to support each other in this journey. It's really difficult, but these values are at the core. It's the glue that holds us together. And I really hope we remember that as we navigate these difficult crises in front of us.
That's a wonderful note to close us out on, Ambassador Verma. Thank you. On behalf of the Belfer Center and the Center for Public Leadership, I'd like to thank Ambassador Menon and Ambassador Verma for their time and valuable insights. So please join me in giving them a big hand. Thank you also to the Belfer Center for organizing and Center for Public Leadership, Annie sitting back there, and personally to Erica and Annie, without whom this event would not have come together and run so smoothly. And thank you to our audience, both in the room and in person. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.